You know that moment that should be all joy, but suddenly becomes a mirror of everything that's wrong around us? Well, yes. On my 75th birthday, I heard, hidden behind the kitchen door, the cruelest sentence a woman can hear. I hope she dies soon, and worse. It was my daughter-in-law who said that, the woman I once welcomed as a daughter. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just froze. In that moment, I realized that what had been consuming me for the past few months wasn't age. It was emotional poison. The silent manipulation, the invisible pain, and the abandonment disguised as care began to make sense. I was being destroyed from within. And it wasn't just metaphorical. The greatest family betrayal of my life was served daily in the form of altered medications, fake smiles, and calculated hugs. While everyone sang happy birthday, I saw family ruins behind the candles on the cake. It was then that I understood. Either I chose myself, or I would die playing the victim. This isn't a story of despair. It's about quiet survival, about how a woman can be reborn at 76, with dignity, strategic justice, and a plan more carefully crafted than any project she's ever undertaken. Because yes, I am an architect, and this time, the project was my own life. Today, I want to share it all with you, because maybe, like me, you're smiling while you're rotting inside. Maybe someone beside you is wearing a mask of care, while slowly preparing for your downfall. If that's you, you need to hear this story through to the end. Here, you'll learn the story of how I transformed my home into a legacy, how I used a dinner party as a stage for revelation, and how justice may be late, but never fails. You won't leave this story the same way you entered. So, take a deep breath and come with me. The day dawned with that strange silence, as if the world knew what I didn't yet. The breakfast table was set, the flowers were pastel, and a simple cake with white frosting waited in the corner. My 75th birthday arrived as an achievement, but also as a warning whispered from my soul. I sensed something was off, but I still couldn't put my finger on it. My children arrived later than usual. My grandson gave me a hurried hug, and my daughter-in-law, was more attentive than ever. She offered me chamomile tea, straightened my blanket, and praised my strength. But there was a cold glint in her eyes, a care that felt more like control. I sat in the living room armchair, the blanket draped over my knees, my eyes fixed on the unlit fireplace. Outside, the sun was streaming timidly through the window. And inside me, a thick fog was gathering. The joint pain was already common, but in the last few months, something different was consuming me, a fatigue that wouldn't go away with rest. When I got up to go to the bathroom, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. I approached quietly. The half-open door revealed my daughter-in-law and my son talking quietly. That's when she said, in a dry, laughing tone, "I hope she dies soon. We can't wait that long." At that moment, my soul seemed to fall into an icy pit. Time stood still. I wanted to scream, demand explanations, but something inside me urged silence. A strategic silence. It was as if my intuition was saying, calm, observe, discover, and then act, and that's what I did. I returned to the living room smiling, as if nothing had happened. I feigned surprise at the sight of the cake, thanked them for the birthday wishes, and cut the first slice. Every gesture I made there was a mask, of fragility, of trust, of affection. But inside, I was counting the seconds and remaking plans. I wasn't going to die, not like that. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling as if it were the sky of my new life, a life that hadn't yet taken shape, but that needed to be born from there. I thought about the projects I'd abandoned, the pearls I'd inherited from my mother, and I promised myself I would transform this invisible pain into justice, and this house into redemption. The next day, everything seemed normal, at least to the outsider. The household routine continued with tea, pills, and naps interspersed with lukewarm conversations. But inside me, a silent fire was raging. I couldn't show it, not yet. Survival required strategy. I began to observe the details with an architect's attention. The medicine my daughter-in-law brought without its packaging, the tea with a slightly different flavor, my son's distressed look when I refused something. Small traces of a malignant plan. It was as if they were dismantling me piece by piece, little by little, without leaving any visible marks. That's when I called Martha. She'd worked with me for over 20 years, since the days at the office. She knew my silences, my codes, and my limits. With her, I didn't need to explain too much. A quiet sentence with long pauses was enough. When she heard my request for coffee, she came that same afternoon. We sat in the kitchen, where we'd so often shared dreams and project sketches. But this time, the project was different. I shared some of what I'd heard, tested the waters, and she quickly understood. "You want me to stick around, right?" I nodded. She held my hand firmly. "I'm with you." From start to finish, that was the first light that came on. From that moment on, I began the game of disguise. I continued to smile at my daughter-in-law, thanked her for every cup of tea, and praised her dedication to the house. The more she believed she was in control, the more freedom I had to move behind the scenes. It was like designing a trap engineered with pinpoint precision. The nights became my allies. When everyone was asleep, I would rummage through the pantry, write down labels, hide pills, and begin recording everything in a notebook tucked inside a fake book. It was my war diary. I knew justice wouldn't come on its own. It would have to be provoked, planned, and engineered. It was at that point that I stopped being a victim. The pain was still there, of course, but I was moving. I refused to wither away as a shadow of my former self. And even though the poison still circulated within me, the antidote was beginning to emerge in the form of resolve, courage, and true alliance. And there, I decided I would rediscover my past. The following week, I connected with someone I hadn't seen in almost 3 decades. Victor. He was my great love as a young man, and for a time, also my architecture partner. We'd gone our separate ways, but we never stopped admiring each other. And at that moment, I needed someone who could see beyond my fragility. I sent a short, almost formal message, but with that tone only old-timers recognize. "Victor, I'm going through something delicate. We need to talk." Less than 2 hours later, he replied. We agreed to meet at the old office, the very one we'd designed together. Just thinking about it made my heart feel firmer. When he saw me, his eyes welled up. "Caroline, what did they do to you?" I smiled, even though I was tired. "They haven't done everything they wanted yet, and that's why I called you." He listened to me with the attention of an architect before a complex blueprint. I calmly explained everything: the slow poisoning, the suspicions, the evidence under construction. Victor didn't hesitate. He said he'd stand by me. "You designed projects that changed this city. Now we're going to design your salvation." He brought more than support. He brought strategy. He reminded me of who I was, reminded me of the woman who stood up to corrupt construction companies without losing her class. And I, right then, began to truly awaken. We also talked about the house. It had always been my refuge and my greatest personal creation. But now it was becoming a place of pain. I told him I wanted to transform it all. What if this house became an educational center, a place for young architects without resources? I suggested. He smiled. "You're coming back," he said softly. That night, when I returned home, I looked at each room with new eyes. The hallway was no longer just a passageway. The kitchen, the scene of the betrayal, would now be remembered as a turning point. The house began to whisper to me, recreate, transform, resignify. And that's what I started doing, in the project and in myself. And so, together with Victor, I laid the first outlines of a new plan. A plan that blended strategic justice, legacy, and belated redemption. I wasn't just a victim trying to escape. I was a woman charting her silent survival, with a firm line, a strong soul, and a heart finally awakening from its anesthesia. I decided to seek medical answers. I no longer wanted to live in doubt, between assumptions and fears. I called Dr. Henrique, my former doctor, who had retired a few years ago. He was always direct, humane, and discreet. If there was anyone I could still trust in that field, it was him. We met at his house on a rainy late afternoon. I brought samples of the medications they were giving me, along with notes on the symptoms I'd been experiencing for months. Dizziness, loss of appetite, memory lapses. He looked at me sadly, as if he understood more than he could say. "Caroline, did they do this to you?" he whispered. Some quick tests were performed on the spot, and the suspicions were confirmed. The levels of substances in my system were altered. It was a slow poisoning caused by compounded medication, a subtle but constant combination that gradually weakened me without leaving any obvious traces. "You're being cruelly silenced," the doctor said, his voice breaking. "This isn't just a crime, it's perversity." He helped me interpret the test results and recommended we seek out an independent laboratory to validate everything with official documents. I agreed. We needed solid evidence, and fast. I returned home with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief in knowing I wasn't imagining things. Anger in understanding that my own son, the boy who once slept in my lap, was involved in this. The betrayed trust was a wound deeper than any clinical diagnosis, but I wasn't going to dwell on it. I took that pain and turned it into action. I stashed the reports in a secret compartment in the studio closet. It was the same one where, years before, I'd hidden confidential projects for famous clients. Now, I was hiding the most valuable piece of my new plan: the truth. That day, looking at my reflection in the bedroom mirror, I saw something different. The features were tired, yes, but there was something in the eyes, a quiet firmness. It wasn't just about saving myself. It was about honoring everything I'd built, all the women I'd ever been, and ensuring that this house and this story wouldn't end in family ruin. It was from the diagnosis that I understood. Their plan was too sophisticated to be faced with emotion. It required strategy, like a complex project, the kind that demands calculation, patience, and symmetry. I was no longer just the betrayed mother. I was an architect redesigning my own destiny. And that included documenting every detail. I installed hidden cameras around the house with Martha and Victor's help. Nothing invasive, but enough to capture movement in the kitchen, pantry, and hallways. I also began discreetly recording audio with a small recorder attached to my robe. It was like constructing an invisible timeline, one where the pieces would fit together perfectly at the right moment. I asked Martha to start observing pharmacy deliveries, medication schedules, and her daughter-in-law's gestures. She became my eyes where I couldn't be. He wrote everything down in code, like the days when we managed construction sites. The difference was that now, the land was my own home. And what was at stake was my life. I feigned weakness. I pretended to forget, dropped objects on the floor as if I were getting worse. With each feigned sigh, I gained more trust from them. It was painful to interpret my own decline, but I knew I needed them to believe in the success of the plan. Only then would I have time to complete mine. Meanwhile, I began discreetly visiting social institutions linked to architecture. I met young talents without resources, stories of overcoming obstacles, dreams shelved due to a lack of opportunities. The idea for the foundation was taking shape. I didn't just want to punish my tormentors. I wanted to leave a legacy. My house wouldn't be an inheritance of greed, but a seed of transformation. Victor suggested I create a timeline. Like a construction site, we organized each stage: evidence gathering, allies' involvement, formalizing the foundation, and finally, the confrontation. It would be a dinner, a family celebration, a perfect setting to unveil the truth before everyone, a table of revelations. At that moment, I realized I was no longer a hostage to pain. Silent survival gave way to lucid leadership. I was driving the story, even if from behind the scenes. And amidst champagne glasses, discreet cameras, and feigned glances, I began to plot the outcome. Because no one suspected that the weakened woman was, in fact, the author of a brilliant plan. The house began to transform in an almost symbolic way. Every detail, every piece of decor, every redesigned plant. It was as if I were cleansing the space of the shadows that surrounded it. At the same time as I prepared the stage for the final dinner, I was shaping the spaces into what they would become: rooms of learning, of creation, of hope. I announced a family dinner under the pretext of celebrating my recovery. I made sure to invite everyone: my children, my daughter-in-law, some former colleagues, and 2 representatives from a charity partner of the Future Foundation. The excuse was simple: to say thank you. But in reality, everything there would be recorded, including audio and video. Victor handled the technical aspects: camera positioning, sound quality, and coordination with allies. I handled the aesthetics. The table had to be impeccable: crystal glasses, linen tablecloths, candlelight. Everything was beautiful, welcoming, and symbolic. A feast for the eyes and a tribunal for the souls. In the center of the table, I placed the pearl necklace inherited from my mother, a symbol of feminine strength and dignity passed down from generation to generation. Beside it, a framed photo of me and my young children. I wanted them to see the contrast: the woman who raised and the woman who now faced them. Martha was in charge of serving wine and dinner. The main course was the same as the first Christmas dinner I had as a single mother. Yes, everything had a purpose. Every aroma, every memory, every sigh carried a piece of the story I was about to retell, with facts, evidence, and courage. Before the toast, I asked to speak. Eyes met, smiles faded. My daughter-in-law gently squeezed my son's arm. They knew something was coming, but they couldn't imagine the magnitude. I took a deep breath, touched the necklace around my neck, and said, "Today, more than celebrating life, let's clarify some truths." At that moment, the room fell silent. I knew there would be no turning back from that moment. But I also knew that dining table wasn't just a place to eat. It was the center of my strategic justice, and I was ready to serve, not the main course, but the truth, in its rawest and most revealing form. After my opening remarks, there was an uncomfortable silence. Some guests laughed nervously. Others hid it, stirring their glasses. My son tried to soften the mood. "I think Mommy was a little overly emotional today, huh?" But I didn't smile. I just looked at the camera hidden in the lamp and began narrating the past few months. I recounted the strange symptoms, the tests, the adulterated medications. I showed copies of the medical reports and videos of my daughter-in-law's suspicious exchanges in the kitchen. Each piece of evidence was like a brick being laid in the foundation of truth. And there, in front of everyone, I built what they thought would never exist: justice. My daughter-in-law paled. She tried to interrupt, to call me paranoid. But the videos spoke for me. The recordings showed whispered phrases, combined glances, silent manipulations. It was like watching a family betrayal movie. Only this time, the victim was the director of her own script. Victor handed a flash drive to the Foundation representatives. "This is the evidence that shows why this house needs to change hands." The impact was immediate. My colleagues looked at me with respect, some with tears in their eyes. My story wasn't just about poisoning. It was about resistance. My son tried to leave, but Martha calmly blocked the door. She didn't shout. She simply said, "You deserve to be heard until the end." Then I realized how much more powerful a true support network can be than any blood bond. Abusive relationships were crumbling, and in their place something new was emerging: collective strength. When I finished, I raised my champagne glass, not in celebration, but in liberation. I thank everyone for coming. Today, this house ceases to be a prison and becomes a project. The legacy they tried to destroy will inspire generations. The toast echoed like a bell of new beginnings, and no one there would ever forget that night. Afterward, I sat alone for a few minutes. I looked at the unmade table, the empty glasses, the pearls on the tablecloth, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. The invisible pain was still there, but now it was accompanied by meaning. I had survived, and more than that, I had overcome with dignity. 2 days after dinner, the evidence was officially handed over to the authorities. Silently, as I always had, I followed the initial proceedings. My son and daughter-in-law were summoned to testify. The charge was serious: attempted, aggravated murder. The poison was now in the records, and no longer in my veins. Victor hired an experienced lawyer to guide me. Everything was done discreetly and firmly. Within a few weeks, the investigation progressed rapidly. The evidence spoke for itself. The videos, the audio, the medical reports. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place, And finally, the masks began to fall. My son tried to claim he knew nothing, that his wife was the one controlling his medication. But the recorded conversations showed otherwise. Justice no longer needed witnesses. The facts were there for all to see. It was strange to see him in that role, the boy I once cradled, now escorted by the police. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, crumbled. She tried to negotiate, to emotionally blackmail, to play the victim. But silent manipulation had no place. The words she spoke on my birthday were now recorded. They weren't just cruel, they were evidence of intent. Justice was slow, but sure. As the process progressed, I began renovations on the house. Each wall that fell, each piece of furniture donated, represented a cycle coming to an end. The foundation began to take shape. Young architects, scholarship holders, volunteer teachers, everyone began arriving. What had once been a symbol of abandonment in old age became a breeding ground for bright futures. The media wanted to cover the case, but I refused. I didn't want to be seen as a victim or a martyr. I simply wanted to rebuild, with dignity, with purpose, with freedom, and above all, with the peace of someone who chose not to retaliate with hatred, but with construction. It was my form of revenge, transforming family ruins into foundations of hope. I reviewed every detail of my journey, the struggles, the projects, the setbacks. I realized it hadn't been in vain. The foundation wasn't just a building, it was my new beginning after the pain. And there, amidst the traces of new lives, I understood, even the slowest poisons can be healed, when the soul chooses to rebuild. At 76, I reinvented myself, not as a return to the past, but as a belated flowering. The hands that once designed structures for others now charted my own path. I returned to teaching, participated in conferences, and was invited to speak on architecture and female resistance, two themes that now went hand in hand. My gray hair, once hidden under discreet dyes, now shone with pride. Every wrinkle told a story, and the pain that once silenced me became the raw material for transformative conversations. Young people who barely knew who I was sat with me to learn, not just about projects, but about courage. The house, completely renovated, was named Fundação Clara Luz, a tribute to my mother, who said that true light never goes out, even in the shadows. Clara was her name, light, her essence. And now, this legacy illuminated new paths, new dreams, new futures. I transformed my old studio into a creative space for women over 60. There, we shared experiences, pains, recipes, and reinventions. It was a place where age was celebrated, not mourned, where silent survivors became active voices, and where each woman rediscovered her dignity. Victor followed me, now with more ease. We never talked about rekindling our romance. Our bond was different, a deep partnership, unhurried, unpressured, an old love, rediscovered at the right time. He looked at me with renewed respect, and I saw him as the one who reminded me of who I was when I'd almost forgotten. My mother's pearls were now displayed in a glass case at the foundation's entrance. No longer hidden, no longer forgotten. They became a symbol of the strength that endures, that endures. Every visitor who passed by understood. That necklace had once been a promise, a pain, and now it was a memory of overcoming. Redesigning your life after 70 isn't utopia. It's a choice. It's resistance. It's a firm line on a blank page. And it was in that line that I rediscovered the woman I almost left behind. Not because I grew older, but because they let me lose faith in my own worth. Never again. Months later, I received a letter from the prison. It was from my son. He wrote with heavy but confusing words, as if he wasn't sure whether he was apologizing or just wanting to be heard. He said he'd been manipulated, that he was ashamed, that he still loved me. I reread the letter several times, and even though it hurt, I replied, "We can talk." The meeting was scheduled in a cold, silent room. When he entered, I felt a lump in my throat. It was the same boy I'd carried in my arms, but now with tired, different eyes. He tried to smile. I didn't smile back. I just waited for him to speak. And what I heard was less a plea for forgiveness and more an attempt to justify himself. "I just wanted to make our lives easier, Mom. She said she'd take care of everything, that you'd lived enough." The words came with effort, but without full regret. He didn't cry. Neither did I. I stood there, listening, like someone watching a building collapse, slowly, but with no hope of rebuilding. I said little. I said I didn't want revenge, but that justice was necessary. That love without respect is unsustainable. That trust, once broken, never returns. And that the bond between us was broken. You are my biological son, but family for me is who cares. And you chose not to. I stood up, straightened my coat, and prepared to leave. He called out to me, "Do you still love me?" I turned slowly, and I replied, "Today, I choose to love myself first." It was the hardest thing I'd ever said, but also the most liberating. There was no hate. There was an end. And with it, the chance to move on in peace. Stepping outside, I breathed in the cold air with a strange relief. The weight I'd carried for years seemed to have stayed there, within those gray walls. I walked to my car with firm steps, and for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of my own choice. Some people say that forgiving is forgetting. I disagree. Forgiving is remembering without holding on. It's looking back and understanding that it happened, but that it doesn't define who you are now. And it was with this certainty that I left the past in that prison. I had a new life waiting for me. And this time, it was mine alone. If you've made it this far, perhaps something inside you is also screaming for change. Perhaps there's an invisible pain slowly consuming you, or a relationship that, to others, appears caring, but inside is pure emotional poison. The truth is, we often take a while to see how much we're being hurt by those who should protect us the most. This story isn't about resentment. It's about starting over with dignity, about understanding that you don't have to accept abandonment just because you've grown old, that blood ties are no excuse for toxic relationships, and that loving another can't mean forgetting yourself. Caroline survived, and so can you. Now I ask you, what part of your story is still being written with other people's ink? What do you still accept in the name of peace, but deep down is making you sick? And if today were your last birthday, would you feel at peace with what you've experienced? Or would you still be waiting for someone to truly see you? Perhaps today is the time to transform your pain into a plan, your silences into voice, your inner home into a new project. You are not alone. Many women have already broken patterns that seemed immutable and have been reborn stronger, lighter, more their own. If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment about which city you're talking about, and if you've experienced something similar. Your voice could be a turning point for another woman too. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week, real stories like this will remind you that starting over is always possible.